The night my husband threw divorce papers onto my fever-soaked bed and called me a useless burden. He believed he had already won. He thought I was weak, broke, and finished. He kicked me out while I was barely breathing, laughed about marrying another woman, and walked away confident I'd disappear quietly. What he didn't know was that the moment he shut that door, everything he owned and everything he was already slipping out of his hands. Before I take you through how that night unfolded and why his certainty would crumble so fast, take a moment to support this story. Subscribe and tell me in the comments which city or country you're watching from, so I know how far this journey reaches. I was lying in the master bedroom of our house in Silverwood Heights, a quiet, upscale neighborhood just outside Brighton City. From the outside, the house looked like success: tall windows, manicured lawn, a driveway wide enough for 2 luxury cars. Inside, it felt like a hollow shell. The air conditioning hummed softly, but my body burned as if I were lying under a blazing sun. My nightgown was soaked through with sweat. My hair clung to my temples, my throat felt raw, and every breath scraped painfully through my chest. I had been sick for days, not the kind of sick that earns sympathy or patience, the kind that makes people uncomfortable, weak, inconvenient. That morning, I had asked my husband, Victor Lang, to pick up medicine on his way home from work. Fever reducers, antibiotics, anything to stop the spinning in my head and the fire in my lungs. He didn't even look at me when he left. Hours passed. Daylight faded into evening. Evening into night. The house stayed silent. Too silent. The ticking clock in the hallway grew louder with each second, as if it were counting something down. I tried to reach for the glass of water on the nightstand. My hand shook violently. The glass slipped from my fingers and shattered on the thick rug, water soaking into the fibers. I stared at the mess without moving. I didn't have the strength to clean it. I barely had the strength to cry. Victor hadn't always been like this. Once, we had lived in a cramped, 1-bedroom apartment in Northbridge, counting every dollar. I had worked late shifts while he chased unstable jobs and big promises. When he failed, I stood beside him. When he doubted himself, I reassured him. When he finally caught his break, I believed it would make him kinder. It didn't. Success sharpened him. Power inflated him. And my illness, my weakness, became something he despised. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway jolted me awake. Relief flooded my chest. He was back. Surely, he had brought the medication. I forced myself upright, my back screaming as I leaned against the headboard. The bedroom door didn't open right away. Instead, I heard fast, heavy footsteps, angry footsteps. The door slammed open hard enough to rattle the wall. Victor stood there, tall and composed, wearing an expensive tailored shirt. His hair was perfect, his face calm, controlled. In his hands, there was no pharmacy bag. There was a thick legal folder. "Victor," my voice came out hoarse. "Where are my meds? My head hurts. I can't breathe properly." He laughed. It wasn't nervous. It wasn't awkward. It was satisfied. "Meds," he said. "I brought something far more useful." He walked toward the bed and threw the folder down across my legs. The weight of it felt heavier than it should have. "This," he said coldly, "is the cure for my life." My hands trembled as I stared at the folder. "What is this?" "Open it," he replied, "unless you're afraid." With the last of my strength, I pulled the papers out. The words at the top of the page blurred for a moment before sharpening into something unmistakable. Petition for dissolution of marriage. The room seemed to tilt. Divorce. I whispered. Victor sat on the edge of the bed, keeping his distance like I was something contagious. "Don't look so shocked," he said. "I'm done wasting my life." Tears burned my eyes. What did I do wrong? He didn't hesitate. "You're sick. You're broke. And you're a liability." Each word landed like a strike. "I worked for everything we have," he continued, gesturing around the room. "This house, the cars, the accounts. Everything is in my name. You didn't contribute anything. I stared at him, searching for the man I had married. He was gone. When this is finalized, he said casually, I'm marrying my fiancée. She understands my position. She's healthy. She doesn't drain me. So there was another woman. I don't want to see you here tomorrow morning, Victor added. Take your clothes and leave. I'm staying with her tonight. I'll send someone to make sure you're gone. He stood, straightened his shirt, and walked out. The bedroom door slammed shut. Then the front door. Then the sound of his car leaving the driveway. I was alone, sick, divorced, evicted. I cried until my chest hurt more than my fever, until my tears soaked the pillow beneath my face, until my body felt empty. And then something shifted. The fear drained away, replaced by something colder, sharper. I reached beneath the pillow, not the one I slept on, but the spare I always kept there. My fingers closed around a slim, hard object. A phone. Not the old one Victor knew about. This one was newer, secure, locked with my fingerprint. The screen lit up, bright against the dark room. I opened a single contact, saved under a simple name. Director Elise Rowan. My heart wasn't racing from illness anymore. I pressed call. The line connected instantly. Ms. Arden, a calm woman's voice answered. It's late. Are you all right? I took a slow breath. Elise, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the fever. Activate the contingency plan. There was a brief silence. Then understood. What happened? I was thrown out, I replied. He thinks I'm finished. The woman on the other end exhaled slowly. Then he has made a very expensive mistake. I closed my eyes. Outside, the house was silent. Inside, the game had just begun. The moment I ended the call, my body sagged against the mattress as if the last thread holding me upright had finally loosened. The fever was still there, raging, but my mind was suddenly clear in a way it hadn't been for months. Victor thought sickness made people small. He thought weakness erased intelligence. That had always been his fatal mistake. I lay still, listening. The house had a sound at night I had learned to recognize over the years, a low, hollow hum, as if the walls themselves were breathing. The clock in the hallway continued its steady ticking. Each second felt deliberate now, not threatening. I wasn't counting down anymore. I was counting forward. 10 minutes passed. 15. My phone vibrated once against my palm. A single message lit the screen. We're 10 minutes away. Side entrance. Quiet. I pushed the blanket aside and swung my legs off the bed. The room spun violently, and I grabbed the bedpost just in time to stop myself from collapsing. My feet touched the cold carpet, grounding me. Pain shot at my calves, sharp and dizzying, but I stayed upright. I would not leave this house the way Victor imagined. I reached into the closet and pulled out a long charcoal coat, slipping it over my nightgown. My reflection in the mirror startled me. Pale skin, dark circles under my eyes, hair plastered to my face with sweat. I looked like someone who had been left behind. That was fine. No one ever sees the blade coming when they mistake the sheath for weakness. The front door opened without a sound. 2 people in dark medical scrubs stepped inside, their movements fast and efficient. Behind them came Elise Rowan, silver hair pulled back neatly, posture straight, eyes sharp with concern and focus. She had been like this the first day I met her years ago. Calm, observant, unflinching. She took one look at me and crossed the room in 3 quick steps. You're burning up, she said softly. We're taking you now. I'm ready, I replied. They unfolded a compact stretcher right there in the living room. As they helped me lie down, a needle slid into my arm and cold relief spread through my veins. The world softened at the edges, but my thoughts stayed sharp. As they carried me past the staircase, my gaze landed on the large wedding photo hanging above the console table. Victor and I stood smiling, frozen in a moment that no longer existed. I didn't look away. I didn't flinch. Leave everything, I whispered. I'm not taking a single thing. Elise nodded. You won't need anything from here. Outside, the night air was thick and warm. Instead of an ambulance, a black medical transport van waited at the curb, unmarked and quiet. Inside, it looked more like a private aircraft than an emergency vehicle. Monitors, equipment, clean lines, subdued lighting. As the doors closed, the house disappeared from view. The vehicle moved smoothly through the dark streets of Brighton City, lights passing like distant stars. A doctor checked my vitals and spoke quietly to Elise. Severe infection, he said, but we caught it in time. Time. That word followed me as the fever pulled me into half-consciousness. Memories surfaced uninvited. 5 years earlier, Victor had been unemployed, bitter, pacing our small apartment like a caged animal. Money arguments, pride wounded, anger misplaced. He had insisted I stay home, that it was his responsibility to provide. I had agreed, not because I believed him, but because I didn't want to break him while he was already fragile. What he never knew was that staying home didn't mean staying idle. While he searched job boards, I studied. While he slept, I worked. While he dismissed my late nights as boredom, I built something quietly from nothing. When the van slowed, I felt Elise's hand rest briefly on mine. You did the right thing, she said. I know, I replied. The Kingswell Private Clinic loomed ahead, lights glowing softly. No sirens, no attention, just quiet efficiency. They moved me into a private suite on the top floor, where a team of specialists were already waiting. For lines were connected. Machines hummed. My fever began to break in waves, each one pulling me closer to clarity. Elise stayed until the doctors assured her I was stable. Now, she said, pulling a chair closer to the bed, tell me exactly what he said. I told her everything. The insults, the eviction, the fiancé, the arrogance. Elise's expression didn't change, but something hardened in her eyes. He believes the house is his, she asked calmly. Yes. And the car? Yes. She nodded slowly. Then let him believe it. For now. I smiled faintly. 3 days. 3 days, she agreed. Sleep finally claimed me. Not the feverish kind, but something deeper. When I woke hours later, dawn light filtered through the curtains. My body still ached, but my head was clear. A tablet rested on the bedside table. I picked it up. On the screen was a detailed report, accounts, properties, timelines, legal pathways. Elise didn't waste time. Victor's business loan, the one he bragged about securing on his own merit, the one that funded the house and the luxury car. He had never read the fine print, never asked questions, never imagined someone else might understand contracts better than he did. The debt wasn't owned by the bank anymore. It belonged to Aurelia Group Holdings, and Aurelia belonged to me. By mid-morning, Victor was doing exactly what I expected, celebrating. A live feed appeared on the tablet. Images pulled from public places, social posts, transaction alerts. Victor and his fiancée, Serena Vale, were at a cafe downtown, laughing, toasting, playing the part of victors. He wore confidence like armor. Serena leaned close, already picturing herself as the woman who had replaced me. I felt nothing. No jealousy. No anger. Only precision. Elise, I said quietly when she entered the room. Initiate phase 1. She smiled, thin and professional, already in motion. Across the city, Victor's cards began to fail one by one. At first, he laughed it off, blamed the bank, blamed technology. He always believed inconvenience was temporary. By afternoon, the calls started. He screamed at customer service, demanded explanations, flaunted his status. He didn't yet understand that status means nothing when ownership changes hands. I watched from my hospital bed as his world tilted. He still had 2 days, and I intended to let him enjoy every second of his imagined victory before the ground vanished beneath his feet. Because this wasn't about anger. It was about balance. And balance always arrives quietly right before the fall. By the time the sun rose fully over Brighton City, Victor had already convinced himself that the problems with his accounts were temporary. That was the thing about men like him. They trusted systems only when the systems favored them. When something broke, they assumed it was an error, not a consequence. From the private suite at Kingswell, I watched the city wake up through floor-to-ceiling glass. Traffic thickened. Offices filled. Life moved forward without waiting for anyone's permission, including mine. A nurse adjusted my fore and smiled gently. "Your fever's finally breaking," she said. "Good," I replied. "I need to be clear-headed." She didn't ask why. People who work in places like this learn not to ask questions that don't belong to them. Elise arrived mid-morning, carrying a slim tablet and a coffee I didn't ask for, but accepted anyway. She sat beside my bed, crossed one leg over the other, and tapped the screen awake. "He tried 3 banks," she said calmly. 2 credit card companies. He's now on hold with his company's finance department. I closed my eyes briefly, savoring the image. "What about the emergency account?" I asked. Elise's mouth curved slightly. "He used it this morning. There's very little left." Good. This wasn't cruelty. It was arithmetic. Victor had always lived one promotion away from collapse, one illusion away from truth. He had mistaken proximity to wealth for ownership, confidence for competence. I had simply removed the scaffolding. Late that afternoon, Serena appeared again on the live feed. She looked less radiant now. Her smile was strained. She leaned across a restaurant table, her lips moving too fast, her eyes sharp with suspicion. Victor gestured animatedly, waving his phone like proof of innocence. I didn't need audio to know what he was saying. "It's just a delay. It'll be fixed. Don't worry." That night, while I slept properly for the first time in days, Victor didn't sleep at all. By morning, the formal letter arrived. I imagined the courier ringing the doorbell of the house Victor had so proudly claimed as his. I imagined him opening it barefoot, irritation already on his face, expecting perhaps paperwork from the court. Instead, he would have seen the letterhead. Aurelia Group Holdings. Notice of default. When Elise handed me the digital copy, I read it slowly, deliberately. The language was clean, impersonal, absolute. 3 days. 3 days to settle the full outstanding balance of the loan. Failure to comply would result in immediate asset recovery. House, vehicle, accounts. Victor still didn't know who Aurelia was. That ignorance was my favorite part. By midday, he did what desperate men always do. He went to the bank. The footage came through shortly after. Victor storming into the marble-floored branch he used to boast about, his posture rigid with entitlement. He bypassed the line, slammed his card on the counter. I could practically hear his voice. "I'm a VIP client," Elise narrated calmly as if reading a weather report. They ushered him into a private room. "He's been in there 12 minutes. "Long enough," I said. When Victor emerged, his shoulders were slumped. The man who had walked in expecting apologies walked out, holding confusion and fear instead. He sat in his car for nearly 10 minutes before starting the engine. I knew exactly what he was doing. Searching, researching, typing Aurelia Group Holdings into his phone. When the results loaded, global portfolios, luxury brands, investment arms across continents, I imagined the slow tightening in his chest. Men like Victor never believe the universe is bigger than them. Until it is. The call from Serena came an hour later. He didn't answer. She called again. And again. I wondered how long it would take her to understand that the man she had attached herself to was unraveling faster than she could escape. By evening, Victor was pacing the house like an animal trapped in unfamiliar territory. The house that once made him feel powerful now felt hostile. Too quiet. Too empty. He called his lawyer. The lawyer didn't call back. He called his parents. They didn't answer. He called colleagues. Voicemails. Silence spreads fastest when reputation cracks. That night, Elise visited again. They've scheduled execution for the 3rd morning, she said. Legal. Clean. No delays. I nodded. And Victor? I asked. He's looking for you. I smiled faintly. Of course he is. The next morning, my condition had improved enough for me to sit up without dizziness. The fever was gone, replaced by a steady strength I hadn't felt in months. I dressed slowly, deliberately in clothes Elise had arranged to be brought. Simple, elegant, unmistakably intentional. I was no longer the woman he had thrown out. I was the woman who would watch him understand what he had done. Victor tried to find me everywhere he thought I might go. My parents' house, old friends, even places he'd forbidden me from visiting when we were married. He never once considered that I might be somewhere he didn't control. When he finally broke and called my old number, I let it ring. Once. Twice. On the 3rd ring, I answered. Hello. My voice was calm, healthy. The silence on the other end was immediate and total. Are you better? He asked finally, his voice small. I am, I replied. Where are you? He demanded. I'm busy, I said. You should be too. What is this? His voice rose, desperation bleeding through. What's happening to my accounts? To the house. I paused. You told me the house was yours, I said softly. Didn't you? That's not the point, he snapped. No, I agreed. It isn't. The call ended abruptly. I didn't hang up. He did. That night, Serena packed her bags. I didn't need confirmation to know it was coming. She had never loved Victor. She loved the version of him that looked stable, wealthy, untouchable. That version no longer existed. When the tow truck arrived at dawn on the 3rd day, I was already awake. Elise stood beside me, tablet in hand. It's starting, she said. On the screen, Victor stumbled out of the house in yesterday's clothes, hair uncombed, face gray with exhaustion. He shouted. He argued. He threatened lawsuits he couldn't afford. No one listened. The car was taken first. Then the notices went up on the doors. Then the locks were changed. By mid-morning, Victor Lang, former department head, self-declared provider, stood on the sidewalk with nothing but his phone and the clothes on his back. He had exactly what he'd given me. Nothing. I closed the tablet. Schedule the meeting, I said. With him? Elise asked. Yes. There are moments when closure doesn't come from distance. It comes from proximity. From letting someone see you standing where they never believed you could stand. Bring him to the building, I added. Let him come to me. Elise smiled. He won't recognize the place, she said. No, I replied softly. But he'll recognize me. And when he does, the truth will finish what the numbers started. By the time Victor was escorted out of the house he once paraded like a trophy, the neighborhood had already begun to watch. Curtains twitched. A garage door across the street paused mid-lift, then slowly lowered again. The same people who once smiled politely at his new car now avoided eye contact, afraid embarrassment might be contagious. He stood on the sidewalk with his phone clutched in his hand, staring at the foreclosure seals like they were written in a foreign language. The tow truck rumbled away, dragging the car he loved more than anything else behind it. The sound lingered longer than it should have, like a punctuation mark. Victor still believed there was a conversation left to have, a misunderstanding to correct, a lever he hadn't yet pulled. He didn't understand that the conversation had ended the night he threw me out. At Kingswell, my discharge papers were signed quietly. No balloons. No fuss. Elise walked beside me as we moved through the private corridor toward the elevator. I felt steady on my feet, strong in a way that surprised even me. You don't have to see him, she said. This can all be handled without contact. I know, I replied, but I want to. She studied my face for a moment, then nodded. Then we'll do it on your terms. The car ride to Aurelia Tower was smooth, silent, insulated from the noise of the city. As the building rose into view, all glass and steel, I felt something settle inside me. This place wasn't a symbol of power. It was evidence. Victor arrived an hour later. Security informed Elise first. He's downstairs, disheveled, refusing to leave. Bring him up, she said calmly. When the elevator doors opened on the executive floor, I was standing by the window. I didn't turn right away. I watched the city stretch endlessly below me. People moving through lives they didn't know were being quietly rewritten. Then I heard him. A sharp intake of breath. Footsteps that faltered. I turned. Victor stood frozen, just inside the doorway, his eyes darting across the polished floor. The expansive view, the subtle hum of a place designed for authority. He looked smaller here, unanchored, like someone who had wandered into the wrong life. You, he whispered. I smiled, faint and polite. Hello, Victor. You, his voice cracked. What is this place? I took a step forward. My heels echoed softly. This, I said, is where I work. He laughed, high and panicked. Don't do that. This isn't funny. Where's Elise? I need to speak to whoever's in charge. I am, I replied. The silence stretched. His gaze moved slowly back to me. Searching my face for the weakness, he remembered. He didn't find it. This is a joke, he said hoarsely. You're sick. You don't even... I own Aurelia, I said simply. All of it. The words landed without drama, without anger, just truth. Victor staggered backward like he'd been struck. No, he breathed. That's not possible. It is, I said. And it always was. He shook his head violently. You stayed home. You barely spent money. You. I was building, I interrupted, while you were performing. The room seemed to tilt for him the way my world once had. Those late nights on your phone, he whispered. You said you were reading. I was, I replied. Contracts, proposals, market reports. His mouth opened, closed. You let me think. I let you assume, I corrected. There's a difference. Elise entered quietly and stood beside me, her presence calm and immovable. Victor Lang, she said, your time is limited. Victor dropped to his knees. The sound was sharp, final. I'm sorry, he sobbed. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. I know, I said. That surprised him. I know you didn't know, I continued. That's why this hurts. He reached for me instinctively, then stopped, his hand trembling in the air like he'd forgotten how to touch. Please, he whispered. Fix this. I'll do anything. I looked down at him, really looked. At the man who had called me a burden while I was dying. At the man who had measured worth in appearances and obedience. There's nothing left to fix, I said quietly. Only things left to understand. Elise slid a folder onto the table behind him. Victor turned, crawling toward it, ripping it open with shaking hands. Termination notice. Asset recovery confirmation. Confession affidavit. Each page stripped another layer away. I'll lose everything, he whispered. You already did, I replied. You just didn't notice when it happened. Tears streamed down his face. What do you want from me? I leaned closer, lowering my voice, so only he could hear. I want you to remember this feeling, I said. Every time you think you were wronged. Every time you blame someone else. This is the cost of believing power is louder than integrity. I straightened. You can go now. Security stepped forward. Victor didn't resist as they lifted him to his feet. He didn't fight as they guided him toward the elevator. At the threshold, he turned one last time. I loved you, he said weakly. I met his gaze evenly. No, I said. You loved how small you thought I was. The doors closed. When the elevator descended, taking Victor with it, I exhaled slowly. It wasn't triumph, I felt. It was completion. Outside, the city continued its rhythm. unaware that one life had just collapsed while another stood fully upright for the first time in years. And this wasn't the end. It was only the moment the truth became unavoidable. The elevator doors closed with a sound so soft it almost felt merciful. Victor disappeared from view, carried downward by polished steel and gravity, while I remained standing in the quiet certainty of my own space. For several seconds, no one spoke. Elise watched me carefully, not with concern, but with respect. She had seen powerful men fall before. She understood that collapse rarely looked dramatic in the moment. It looked like silence, disbelief, and a body that no longer knew where to stand. "Are you all right?" she asked finally. "Yes," I said, and meant it. My chest felt light. Not empty, light. As if something heavy had been lifted away and I could finally breathe fully. She nodded once. Then the next phase proceeds. Victor didn't leave the building with dignity. Security escorted him through the lobby, where employees pretended not to stare, but couldn't help themselves. He was no longer a guest, no longer a threat. He was a lesson walking on two legs. The glass doors opened, and the city swallowed him again. I watched from the upper floor as he stepped onto the sidewalk, shielding his eyes from the sun. He looked up once, instinctively, toward the tower, toward me, toward the truth he had never bothered to look for. Then he turned away. That was the last time I saw him standing. The first night after the confrontation, I stayed late in the building. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I walked through floors Victor would never enter, offices he had unknowingly financed with borrowed confidence. The hum of quiet productivity surrounded me. People working because they believed in something. People who didn't need to shout to be powerful. Elise joined me in the boardroom just before midnight. She set a thin folder in front of me. "Serena Vale," she said. "She's panicking." I opened the folder slowly. Inside were photographs, financial records, timestamps. Not surveillance, documentation. Everything clean. Everything legal. "She's contacted 3 attorneys today," Elise continued. "None are willing to represent her." "Because of the clause?" I asked. "Yes." I nodded. Serena had believed she was stepping into a life. She hadn't realized she was stepping into evidence. "What about Victor?" I asked. "He tried to stay with a colleague," Elise said. "Was turned away. He's currently sleeping in a budget motel near the Freight District." I didn't react. "He also attempted to access his company's systems," she added. IT flagged it immediately. Good. That company, the one he had built his identity around, had always been fragile. A mid-tier firm inflated by posturing and optimism. Victor had been loud, not competent. When Aurelia quietly acquired majority control months earlier, no one thought to tell him. There was no reason to. The next morning, the termination notice was delivered. Not by email, by courier. Victor opened it, sitting on the edge of a motel bed that smelled faintly of bleach and desperation. He read it twice, then a third time. Then he screamed. I wasn't there to hear it, but I didn't need to be. I knew the sound. It was the sound of a man realizing he had mistaken access for ownership. Serena called him shortly after. He answered. That was his mistake. They fought. Loudly. Bitterly. She accused him of lying. He accused her of abandoning him. They both accused the universe of unfairness. Neither of them said my name. They didn't need to. By afternoon, Serena had packed what she could carry and left the city. She thought distance might save her. It wouldn't. The lawsuit reached her by the end of the week. She tried to sell what she could, bags, jewelry, dresses, all gifts Victor had given her. The market was cruel. Luxury loses value quickly when the story behind it turns sour. Her friends stopped answering her calls. Her invitations dried up. She learned, painfully, what Victor never had. That proximity to power is not protection. Victor lasted longer on the street than I expected. Pride can keep a man standing long after logic tells him to sit. For 3 days he wandered between coffee shops and public benches, charging his phone wherever he could, trying to reconstruct a version of his life where he was still someone important. He told strangers he had been wronged, that his ex-wife had connections, that he would be fine once things were sorted. No one listened. On the fourth day, hunger broke him. He stood outside a labor depot before sunrise, hands in his pockets, shoulders hunched. Men around him smoked, joked, waited for their names to be called. No one recognized him. No one cared. He took the work. Sacks, crates, loading trucks under a sun that didn't care about degrees or titles. I received the report that evening. I closed it without comment. Weeks passed. I returned to living. Not surviving, not hiding, but living deliberately. My schedule filled with meetings, launches, decisions that affected thousands of people. I traveled. I spoke. I signed documents Victor wouldn't have understood if he'd tried. Sometimes, late at night, I remembered the woman who had lay sweating in that bed, believing she had no options. She felt very far away. Victor changed physically. His hair grew unkempt. His posture collapsed inward. The confidence that once filled rooms now barely filled his own body. He lost weight rapidly, not from effort, but from stress and malnutrition. Once he walked past a store window and didn't recognize his own reflection. He laughed. It was a dry sound. Almost impressed. Serena's downfall was quicker. The court didn't care about her tears or her excuses. Evidence doesn't flinch. She settled for far less than the claim, leaving her with debts she would carry for years. The life she'd imagined vanished faster than it arrived. She sent me one message. Just one. I didn't know he was like that. I never replied. Victor never messaged me again. But one evening, months later, I saw him. I was driving through an intersection downtown when traffic slowed. A large screen mounted on a building played a live business segment. My face filled the display briefly as a journalist asked a question about expansion into new markets. I answered calmly. I never stopped working, I said. I never stopped believing in my own worth. As the car moved forward, I caught a glimpse of someone sitting on the curb beneath the screen. A man with a paper bag of food at his feet. He was staring up, not with anger, not with regret, with understanding, the kind that arrives too late to save you, but just in time to teach you who you were wrong about all along. The light changed. Traffic moved, and I drove on. The city had a way of erasing people who stopped keeping up. It didn't announce their disappearance or mourn their fall. It simply kept moving, layering new faces and new stories over the old ones until the past became invisible. Victor was learning that lesson slowly, one blistered hand and sleepless night at a time. By the time winter crept into Brighton City, his days followed a brutal rhythm. He woke before dawn on whatever surface he had claimed the night before, sometimes the narrow bed of a shared room, sometimes the back seat of an unlocked car, sometimes a bench near the freight yards where the noise never really stopped. His clothes smelled permanently of sweat and dust. His hands, once manicured and expressive, were cracked and swollen. The skin split open from hauling loads heavier than anything he had ever chosen to carry. He stopped thinking in terms of weeks or months. Time became measured in meals, in pay envelopes, in whether the weather would be kind or cruel. The man who once lectured others about ambition now waited silently for instructions, grateful when his name was called, invisible when it wasn't. And still, in the quiet moments between exhaustion and sleep, his mind returned to me, not with anger anymore, with confusion. He replayed our marriage like a poorly edited film, scenes he had dismissed suddenly sharp with meaning. My late nights, my calm when he raised his voice, the way I never asked him for money, never fought him over purchases, never seemed impressed by his promotions. He had mistaken indifference for dependence. That realization haunted him far more than hunger. Meanwhile, my life moved in the opposite direction, forward, outward, expanding with purpose. The board approved new initiatives. Markets opened. Partnerships solidified. I stood at podiums and conference tables with the same quiet certainty I once used to survive Victor's contempt. People listened. They didn't interrupt me. They didn't question my authority. And I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. One afternoon, Elise joined me in my office overlooking the river. She set down a file thicker than the others. "This is the final update," she said. "After this, there will be no further monitoring." I opened the file slowly. Victor's employment history since his termination was a short list of temporary labor positions. No references, no stability. His credit was non-existent. His reputation, once inflated far beyond its merit, had evaporated completely. He had tried, briefly, to reinvent himself online. A profile claiming consultancy experience. A few bold statements about leadership and strategy. It lasted less than a week before disappearing under scrutiny. People don't forget humiliation when it's public. "What about Serena?" I asked. Elise's expression didn't change. She moved again. Different city. Same problems. I closed the file. "That's enough," I said. "Let it end here." Elise nodded. "It already has. For them." That night, I attended a gala hosted by partners from abroad. The room shimmered with conversation and quiet confidence. I moved through it easily, engaging when I wanted, retreating when I didn't. I caught my reflection in a mirrored wall. Composed, centered, unmistakably present. I remembered how Victor once told me I faded into rooms. I smiled at the thought. Weeks later, on a cold evening thick with fog, Victor made a decision that surprised even him. He walked, not toward shelter, not toward work, toward the river. He didn't intend to jump. That idea never fully formed. What he wanted was quiet, a place where the city's judgment couldn't reach him. He sat on a concrete embankment, pulling his jacket tighter, watching the lights reflect on the dark water. For the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about survival. He was thinking about truth. About the night he threw papers onto a bed and called a woman useless. About how easy it had been to believe that strength belonged only to those who spoke loudest. About how wrong he had been. The cold seeped into his bones, but he didn't move. Across the river, a large screen flickered to life, illuminating the fog. A familiar logo appeared, followed by a live broadcast from an international summit. My face filled the screen. Victor's breath caught in his throat. He stood slowly, as if afraid the image might vanish if he moved too fast. People around him paused, drawn by the brightness, the sound. None of them recognized him. All of them recognized me. The interviewer asked a question about leadership under pressure. I answered without hesitation. Real power, I said, is quiet. It doesn't need permission. It doesn't announce itself. It simply endures. Victor felt something in his chest give way, not break but release. For the first time he didn't feel anger. He felt clarity. He laughed softly, a sound swallowed by the fog. "I see it now," he murmured, though no one heard him. The screen changed. Applause followed. Life continued. Victor sat back down, pulling the jacket tighter, the cold finally biting deep enough to matter. He didn't cry. He didn't curse. He simply watched the water until the broadcast ended and the screen went dark. When he stood again, his posture was different. Smaller, but honest. He walked away from the river without looking back. And somewhere deep within him, a truth settled that would never leave him. He hadn't lost his life because of me. He had lost it because he never bothered to see me. While he faded into the city's endless motion, I continued forward, unaware of the exact moment he stopped haunting my thoughts. That perhaps was the truest ending of all. Not his ruin, but my freedom. The first snow of the season fell quietly over Brighton City, softening the sharp edges of winter and muting the noise of the streets. It was the kind of snow that made everything look clean for a moment, as if the city itself were offering forgiveness. Victor noticed it only because the cold finally pushed through the thin layers of clothing he wore. settling deep into his bones. He had found work unloading deliveries at a wholesale market near the industrial district. The shifts were irregular, the pay inconsistent, but it was work. Honest, exhausting work that left his muscles screaming and his hands numb. He no longer complained. Complaints required energy, and energy was something he had learned to ration carefully. Each morning, he joined the line of men outside the warehouse gates. They stood close together, shoulders hunched, breaths visible in the cold air. No one asked questions. No one shared stories. Survival had a way of making people silent. Victor had stopped telling anyone who he used to be. The memories were still there, but they had changed shape. They no longer felt like trophies or regrets. They felt like lessons carved too deeply to ignore. Sometimes when the work slowed and his thoughts drifted, he remembered the way I used to look at him during arguments. Not angry, not afraid, just observant. At the time, he had mistaken it for weakness. Now, he understood it had been restraint. Meanwhile, my life moved through seasons of its own. Spring arrived with a flood of meetings, travel, and expansion plans. Aurelia's presence grew stronger in markets. Victor had once bragged about understanding. I stood on stages in cities he had only visited on company expense accounts, speaking about resilience, innovation, and quiet leadership. People asked about my past. I learned how to answer without reopening wounds. I built something slowly, I would say, and I protected it until it could stand on its own. They nodded, taking notes, unaware of how literal that statement was. Elise remained a constant presence, efficient, grounded, fiercely loyal. One afternoon, as we reviewed quarterly reports, she paused and looked at me over the rim of her glasses. "You know," she said, "most people in your position would want updates. Closure. Proof." "I have proof," I replied. "I'm living it." She smiled and returned to her tablet. Summer brought heat and crowds, and with them, reminders of a life I no longer lived. Invitations arrived daily, galas, panels, interviews. I accepted some, declined others. I had learned the value of choosing where my energy went. Victor, on the other hand, had learned how easily energy could be drained away. The heat made the warehouse unbearable. Sweat soaked through his clothes within minutes. The work slowed, tempers flared, and fights broke out over shifts and pay. Victor avoided them all. He had learned that invisibility was safer. One afternoon, a younger worker complained loudly about unfair treatment, about how management didn't recognize his potential. Victor almost laughed. Potential, he realized, meant nothing without humility. He carried that thought with him as he walked back to the small rented room he now shared with two other men. The room smelled of damp concrete and cheap detergent. It wasn't comfortable, but it was shelter. At night, as he lay staring at the cracked ceiling, Victor sometimes wondered what would have happened if he had simply listened. If he had asked questions instead of making assumptions. If he had treated me like a partner instead of a prop in his performance. Those thoughts didn't hurt the way they used to. They simply existed. Autumn arrived again, completing the cycle. Leaves turned, markets shifted, and life continued its relentless forward motion. One evening, after a long board meeting, I stood alone in my office, watching the city lights flicker on below. The glass reflected my image back at me, steady, composed, unmistakably whole. For a moment, I allowed myself to remember the woman I had been lying in that bed, feverish and discarded. I didn't feel anger or sadness. I felt gratitude. Without that night, I might have stayed hidden longer than necessary. Without his certainty that I would disappear, I might not have stepped fully into my own space. Victor never reached out again. Not because he didn't want to, but because he finally understood that some doors close not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. And I understood something too. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, waits, and lets people face the quiet consequences of their own choices. The city continued to change around us, indifferent to our individual stories. Snow would fall again. Spring would return. New lives would rise while others faded into the background. And somewhere within that endless movement, two paths that once ran side by side now moved forever apart. One fading into anonymity, the other standing fully, unapologetically in the light. That was not an ending. It was simply the point at which the story no longer needed to be told from both sides. The city never stopped changing, but it remembered in strange ways. Victor learned that when winter returned sharper than before, when the wind cut through alleys and under bridges with a cruelty that felt personal, he had moved again, another room, another temporary arrangement that barely held. The men he lived with came and went. Names were exchanged once, then forgotten. Everyone was temporary. Everything was conditional. He had stopped checking his phone for messages that would never come. The device itself was old now, the screen cracked, the battery unreliable. It matched the rest of his life, functioning just enough to keep going, never enough to feel secure. Each morning, he walked past glass buildings that reflected a version of the world he no longer belonged to. Suits, coffee cups, laughter, purpose. He used to walk like that once, believing the city bent slightly in his favor. Now the city didn't see him at all. At a construction site near the river, Victor worked hauling debris and sorting scrap. The foreman paid in cash at the end of the day, no questions asked. Victor preferred it that way. Paper trails reminded him of how easily things could be taken. One afternoon, as he dragged a rusted beam toward the collection pile, he overheard two younger workers talking. "Did you see her interview last night?" one asked. "Yeah, the Aurelia woman. Insane story. They say she built everything herself. Quietly. Figures. The dangerous ones always do." Victor's hands tightened around the metal. They weren't talking about him. They were talking about me. He didn't look up. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. The truth no longer shocked him. It settled, heavy and familiar, like a weight he carried every day. That night he walked further than usual, past the neighborhoods he once avoided, into streets that smelled of oil and old rain. He ended up at a soup kitchen he'd passed a dozen times but never entered. Pride had kept him outside until hunger finally outweighed it. Inside, volunteers moved efficiently, ladling soup, handing out bread, offering smiles that didn't ask questions. Victor took a bowl and sat at a long table beside strangers who looked just as tired as he felt. No one stared. No one judged. For the first time in months, he felt something close to relief. Across the city, my life had settled into a rhythm that felt almost peaceful. The chaos of expansion slowed into stability. Systems ran smoothly. Decisions became less reactive and more deliberate. I spent less time proving and more time shaping, mentoring young founders, supporting initiatives that reminded me of my own beginnings. One evening after a panel discussion, a young woman approached me. She looked nervous, clutching a notebook to her chest. "I just wanted to say," she began, "your story helped me leave a situation I thought I couldn't survive." I studied her face, hopeful, afraid, determined. "You already survived it," I said gently. "Leaving is just the next step." She nodded, tears brimming, and thanked me before walking away. I stood there for a moment longer, absorbing the weight of that exchange. I hadn't told my story to punish anyone. I had told it to illuminate something important. Victor never knew about moments like that. He never saw the ripple effects of the life he once tried to shrink. He only knew the echo of his own choices, reverberating through days that looked painfully similar. Winter deepened. One night, as Victor walked back to his room, snow beginning to fall again, he passed a storefront television glowing in the dark. A crowd had gathered, nothing dramatic, just people pausing on their way home. The screen showed a familiar logo. Aurelia. He stopped walking. The broadcast was live coverage of a new initiative, affordable housing projects funded through a private-public partnership. My face appeared briefly, framed by microphones and lights. "This isn't about charity," I was saying. It's about responsibility. When you have the means to build, you also have the duty to protect. Victor felt his chest tighten, not with pain, not with anger, but with something quieter, recognition. The woman on the screen wasn't the woman he had thrown out. She wasn't the woman he had underestimated. She was someone else entirely, someone he had never truly known. The crowd began to disperse. Victor remained until the screen went dark, then turned away, pulling his coat tighter as the snow thickened. He didn't curse. He didn't cry. He simply walked on. Spring came again, slow and tentative. Victor found steadier work at the market, unloading produce in the early mornings. The hours were brutal, but predictable. He saved what little he could, not for ambition, but for survival. He stopped thinking about the past as something to undo. Instead, he carried it like a scar, unavoidable, instructive. One morning, while sweeping the loading dock, he overheard a radio playing inside a truck. The announcer spoke excitedly about a business awards ceremony. Chairperson of the year goes to... Victor turned away before hearing the name. He didn't need it anymore. Across town, I sat in a quiet office signing final documents for the same housing project. The building was nearly complete. Soon, families would move in, people who needed stability, safety, a place to start over. I stood by the window afterward, watching workers move efficiently below. Life in motion. Purpose made visible. Elise joined me, handing over a cup of tea. "You've changed the narrative," she said. "So have they," I replied, thinking of the people whose lives would intersect with these spaces. "Everyone does, eventually." She nodded. As the sun dipped below the skyline, casting long shadows across the city, I felt a deep sense of closure. Not because everything was perfect, but because it was honest. Victor existed somewhere in that same city, living a life stripped of illusions. I existed here, fully present, fully accountable. We no longer shared a story. And that finally was enough. The city was awake long before the sun rose, humming with the low, constant noise of movement that never truly stopped. Somewhere between night and morning, when the streets were quiet enough to hear your own footsteps, but busy enough to remind you that life didn't pause for anyone, Victor stood outside the market gates waiting for work. His breath formed pale clouds in the air. His hands were shoved deep into his jacket pockets, fingers stiff and scarred. The man who once checked the time on a polished watch now judged the hour by the color of the sky. Gray meant early. Pink meant hope. Full daylight meant he'd probably missed the best-paying jobs. He didn't complain anymore. Complaints had become a luxury. When his name was called, he stepped forward without hesitation. A clipboard was thrust toward him, a number scribbled beside his name. No greeting. No acknowledgement beyond necessity. That was how he preferred it now. Being seen invited questions. Questions led to explanations. And explanations led back to a life that no longer existed. As he worked, lifting crates and stacking boxes, his mind drifted, not backward in longing, but sideways into understanding. He thought about power, how he once believed it came from titles, from money, from the way people deferred to him in meetings. He had thought dominance was strength, that control meant safety. He understood now how shallow that belief had been. Strength, he realized too late, was quiet. It was patience. It was preparation. It was knowing when to speak and when to let others reveal themselves. It was everything I had been while he was busy underestimating me. By midday, his back screamed in protest. He wiped sweat from his face with the back of his hand and accepted the folded bills the foreman passed him. He counted them once, carefully, then tucked them into his wallet. Enough for food. Enough for rent. Enough to get through another day. That was victory now. Across the city, my morning unfolded very differently, though just as deliberately. Sunlight poured into my apartment through wide windows, casting soft shadows across clean lines and calm spaces. I moved through the morning with ease. Tea instead of coffee, silence instead of noise. The pace of my life had slowed, not because I had less to do, but because I no longer rushed to prove anything. After breakfast, I reviewed reports from teams spread across continents, expansion updates, community initiatives, measurable impact, numbers that represented real lives, real change. I signed documents that would secure funding, authorize construction, protect futures. I paused once, pen hovering above the page, and allowed myself a moment to reflect on the strange symmetry of it all. The night Victor threw me out, he believed he was ending something. In reality, he had simply removed himself from the story. Later that day, I visited one of the housing developments we had funded. The building stood tall and solid, sunlight glinting off fresh windows. Children's laughter echoed faintly from a nearby playground. Families moved boxes inside, their voices carrying hope, relief, beginnings. A woman approached me hesitantly, her child clinging to her leg. "Thank you," she said simply. "We didn't think this was possible." I knelt slightly to meet her eyes. "It is," I replied, "and it will keep being possible." She smiled, tears bright in her eyes, and turned back to her family. Moments like that grounded me more than any accolade ever could. They reminded me why I had endured silence for so long, why I had waited, why I had built quietly instead of loudly. That evening, as the city shifted toward night, Victor sat on the edge of his narrow bed in the small room he rented. The walls were thin. He could hear his neighbors arguing softly, a television playing somewhere down the hall. He counted his money again, set some aside, and used the rest to buy dinner from a nearby stall. Rice, bread, something warm. As he ate, he noticed a folded newspaper left on the shared table. The headline caught his eye. It had my name in it. He didn't pick it up right away. For a long moment, he simply stared at the words, letting them exist without reaction. Then, he unfolded the paper carefully and read. It wasn't sensational. It wasn't cruel. It was factual. A profile. An overview of growth, leadership, quiet resilience. It spoke about strategy, vision, long-term thinking. It spoke about me as if I had always been this way. Victor exhaled slowly. He didn't feel anger. He didn't feel regret in the sharp, suffocating way he once had. He felt acceptance. The kind that settles in when you finally understand that the past cannot be negotiated with, and that the future belongs to those who prepare for it. He folded the paper neatly and placed it back on the table. That night, he slept without dreaming. Weeks turned into months. Victor stabilized. Not upward, not dramatically, but steadily. He found consistent work at the market. He saved enough to move into a slightly better room. He replaced his worn jacket with a thicker one before winter returned. He learned the names of a few people and let them learn his, though he never shared more than necessary. He became, in many ways, invisible. And invisibility, he discovered, had its own strange peace. I continued forward, no longer measuring time by what had been lost, but by what was being built. New projects, new leaders, new opportunities for people who had been told, once or many times, that they were too small, too quiet, too insignificant. I spoke to them often. "You don't have to announce your strength," I would say. "Just use it." Sometimes late at night, I remembered Victor, not with pain, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. I understood that his greatest mistake had never been cruelty alone. It had been certainty. Certainty that he knew who I was. Certainty that power only flowed one way. Certainty that sickness meant weakness. That silence meant nothing was happening beneath the surface. Certainty had cost him everything. One cold evening, as snow fell again over Brighton City, Victor stood at a bus stop watching flakes collect on the pavement. The city lights blurred through the snowfall, soft and distant. He pulled his jacket tighter and waited. A large screen across the street flickered on, illuminating the snow. A familiar logo appeared. Another interview. Another initiative. My voice carried faintly across the street. "Sometimes the strongest decision is to walk away and build something better," I was saying. Not out of anger, but out of self-respect. Victor watched until the screen changed. Then the bus arrived. He boarded, took a seat by the window, and watched the city slide past. He wasn't chasing anything anymore. He wasn't running. He wasn't pretending. For the first time in his life, he was exactly where his choices had led him, and he finally understood why. And I, miles away, sat in a quiet room reviewing plans for the future, utterly untouched by the weight of his realization. That was the real ending. Not triumph, not punishment, but separation so complete that neither of us needed the other to exist anymore. If you stayed with my story until the end, thank you for listening. If it moved you, support the channel by subscribing and sharing where you're watching from in the comments. Your support helps these stories reach farther than you might imagine.